This is Scott Becker with the Becker Private Equity and Business Podcast. We regularly provide short business episodes, short private equity episodes, interviews with brilliant leaders in private equity and business, as well as periodically profiles and other irrelevant or irreverent topics as well in the Becker Private Equity and Business Podcast. Today, we're joined by a brilliant leader. We're joined by Amber Walsh. Amber's a lawyer who's made her living at the intersection and built this brilliant career at the intersection of healthcare and private equity. In some ways, she's one of the leaders in private equity generally, and particularly one of the leading women in private equity. And that brings us to the topic of the day. There's a couple firms, Preqin being first among them, that covers the stats on women in private equity. It's long been an area where women have lagged behind the demographics in private equity. Amber's going to bring us up to date on the latest report and some of the findings and some of the takeaways. Amber, with that, let me turn it over to Amber Walsh. Amber?
Thank you, Scott. Yeah, the Preqin report is very interesting. We've been tracking this for its 7 years of publishing. They came out with their first report done on an annual basis in 2017. And coincidentally, that happens to be the same year that we founded our own firm, Women in Private Equity and Finance Initiative. So we've been kind of tracking along beside them, along with McKinsey has another very interesting report that comes out annually, Lean In, a few others. What makes Preqin different in their report, number one, it's global. They are a London-based firm, and while they absolutely dive deeply into U.S. statistics, it's not just about U.S. data. They also don't get into things like compensation comparisons, taking lead roles, how women feel about inclusion and belonging, all of those things that some other studies do unabashedly. They are pure numbers. They are telling you the number of women in a variety of alternative asset classes at every level of seniority and tracking that over time, which is really valuable and interesting. But of course, you always have to put multiple different things together to get a real picture of an industry. But that's kind of what the report is.
Thank you. And tell us a few of the takeaways of this year's report.
Yeah, so it shows some incremental progress, actually a little better than in years past, which, to be honest, I was surprised by and very happy to see. So what we see is across the board, and now we're talking worldwide, and then I'll tell you what it is in the U.S. Worldwide, up to 22.8%, and yes, that is up to 22.8% of women at all levels of seniority in private equity globally. And where the U.S. stacks up is, we're kind of right in the middle. That's pretty much where we hit, is right at 23% across all levels of female seniority. There are countries like Sweden, France, China, who perform better in this particular number, others that perform worse. But that's kind of the first thing to know. The next would be that, and this is not going to surprise anyone, you see this across the board in a wide range of industries, but there are dramatically more junior women, and the growth trajectory of junior women, people coming right out of business school or pivoting early in their careers into private equity, is much higher and growing at a higher rate. So where we are right now is 37.2% junior women, by their definition of junior, and 14% senior women. And then when you get to founder level, all of that, of course, it drops even more. This tracks legal industry, consulting, across the board. But at least what we are seeing is progress. And that has been encouraging, but obviously there's a lot of room to grow. So those are kind of the key takeaways from just those numbers that Preqin studies every year.
Fascinating. And where do you see this going? I mean, if you have a crystal ball, you're obviously well situated, middle of leadership of a billion-dollar plus law firm. You see a lot of different things. Where do you see this in terms of what are your observations of the workforce, the private equity, the finance world, women within it? What are you seeing out there?
I expect this to continue to grow. I cannot envision what would make it go faster in terms of an accelerator, but I do expect it to continue to grow. What's very interesting about a focus on women in private equity and women in other parts of the U.S. economy is that we're not receiving as much pushback right now in the world on gender diversity issues as we are on some other diversity issues. We're at a very interesting moment in time where after we reached a peak with the George Floyd situation in 2020 and 2021, companies' responses to other diversity initiatives in ethnic, racial, and other diversity was at an all-time high. It's kind of dropped a little bit since then, and you're seeing some very interesting and complicated pushback. You're not seeing that as much in initiatives around gender diversity, and it's probably because we've been at a relatively steady plane of focal point for many, many years. So that's what I would expect. I would expect it to continue. I would expect a little bit of improvement. I sure wish I could find a way to have that magical catalyst to make it go faster.
100%. No, I think that's a really interesting assessment. You've seen a lot of the movement around diversity move away from specifically women in leadership to a whole number of areas of diversity and leadership. It's still a focus on women, but a bigger focus on diversity of people of color and so forth. That's a fascinating observation, and there's so many different pieces to that. Amber, I'm going to ask you one other question today. You also live in the healthcare private equity deal world. What are you most focused on and excited about currently? What's interesting out there?
Yeah, what's interesting is deal flow continues to increase. It's been slow, but what we've experienced all throughout the past year is this incremental increase in deal volumes. We are not where we were 18 months to 2 years ago, nor do I necessarily think we will be anytime soon. And that was probably an outlier in terms of peak valuations, peak activity, et cetera, at the end of 2022. But we are seeing movement, and we are also seeing what I think is some really interesting conversations, of course, about how to structure deals around considerations of non-competes with the FTC proposed rule, having people try to be very thoughtful about that, and also have investors be very thoughtful about, in light of some of the pushback, some of the investigations and commentary around healthcare investments with private equity investors, we're seeing investors try to be very, very thoughtful about uniting to show their best face on what they do for healthcare. So that is becoming part of deal conversations in a way that it previously was not. So those are the things that excite me.
That's absolutely fascinating. Again, just the heightened regulatory interest and the heightened attention to it from the private equity community, as well as deal flow picking up, particularly in certain segments. Amber Walsh, again, brilliant leader at McGuireWoods and just leader nationally. Thank you so much for joining us today on the Private Equity and Business Podcast. Thank you very, very much.
Thank you, Scott.